The biggest thanks, of course, has to go to our keynote speakers, Debra Allcock-Tyler and Ben Cairns. Debra is Chief Executive of the Directory of Social Change, and Ben is Director and Co-founder of the Institute of Voluntary Action Research, also known as IVAR. I find that an easier one to remember, so forgive me, Ben. So Debra's worked on in the charitable and voluntary sector for more than 30 years. You're hiding it well there, Debra. And amongst many other roles, she's co-chair of the Soldiering On Awards alongside General the Lord Dannatt. Debra served as trustee on several charities, including being co-founder of the Small Charities Coalition and was its first chair. Debra is a renowned public speaker, as you're about to find out. I know that Debra's an entertaining and interesting speaker, so I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Debra. So thank you for joining us, and has many years experience in training and coaching, and is an internationally published author of several books on management and leadership, including Well Done, It's a Battle on the Board, It's Tough at the Top, and The Pleasure and the Pain, It's Merger in Management. Fantastic. Any more for any more? So we'll make the links available in the post-event information that we'll be sending out. And obviously, well, not obviously, but all the money from the sale of Debra's books goes to charity. So I'm now going to hand over to Debra without further ado and put myself on mute. Debra, over to you and welcome.
Thanks, Jane. I tell you what, it's always really handy being thanked in advance. I think Jane's got that out of the way just in case by the time I get to the end of my speech, she's like, I really can't thank her for that. And can I just also say thank you so much for those of you who can keeping your cameras on. I know that not everybody can, and I completely understand that. But as a speaker, it makes such a difference when we're doing it in these remote ways that you can actually see people's faces and you can see them frowning or shaking their fists at you as you speak, or kind of get a sense of how you come across. So I'm super grateful for that. So thank you ever such a lot. So it's my job basically to set the scene for today, to create an image of the wider sector, and I was carefully briefed that it's part of my job to give you hope. But actually I also want you to get a little bit angry too when I talk through my speech today, hopefully not at me, but and that's because I think healthy anger drives healthy action, and I think it's really okay to be quite pissed off about some of the things that we're having to deal with, because that fires us up and makes us want to do things. But I have to start by telling you an absolutely true story. So my father, it would have been like a couple of years ago now, so when people did go out for these things, and he was having lunch with some of his cronies, and they were in this pub, and the waiter came over and said, what would you like for your dinner? And my father decided he'd have a roast chicken dinner. So he said, I'd like the roast chicken dinner. And the waiter said, would you like an egg with that? Now my father was a bit taken aback, because he's like, that's really odd, like to have an egg with a chicken dinner. But then he thought to himself, well, he knows that because my mother watched MasterChef and stuff like that, it might be a really fashionable thing, like maybe this is a chefy thing that they do now, and of course he didn't want to embarrass himself or look stupid by sort of querying the presence of the egg, so he thought, well, I better say yes. So he said, oh yes please, okay, that'd be very nice. Anyway, waiter goes away, father carries on talking to his mates, and then the chicken dinner arrives and there's no egg. So my father looks at this and he's like, and he's thinking to himself, well, they offered me an egg. I said, yes, I'd have an egg, and now there isn't an egg, and that's a bit odd. However, he still didn't feel he could say anything. He felt like, well, I can't really challenge this. I don't want to look stupid and, whatever. So he didn't question the lack of the egg that he thought he was getting on his roast chicken dinner. Anyway, he gets home that evening, and I know this because my mother rings me absolutely weeping with laughter, and she's telling me the story, and she says, your father scared the living bejesus out of me over dinner tonight when he suddenly yelled out of the blue, leg. He was asking me if I wanted a leg. Anyway, that is an absolutely true story, which I still can't tell without crying with laughter. But actually, the key thing about that, I do think that's a metaphor for the world in which we're operating in the sector. Like sometimes we're really afraid to challenge things. We're really afraid to question the information we're being given from tiny little things like terms and conditions in funding or contracts or anything like that, where we feel like we've just got to accept it rather than go back or challenge it. about worrying that, you know, everybody else seems to be doing okay and we're the ones who aren't, about feeling that if our funding application got rejected, that's because we're really shit, rather than the fact that that just might be the nature of the environment in which we're currently operating. So I love that story, mostly because what it says to me is you must challenge everything. You really mustn't just take things for granted. You've got to ask the questions. Do we actually have to do a report every month? Who is actually going to read the information that we're presenting you with? You know, I'm really, really questioning the environment to which we're in. And I think it's particularly important now, because not only are we dealing with the pandemic, and can I just say, it's not the aftermath of the pandemic, by the way, you know, we are still in it. You know, I was with on a board that I sit on, and some of the people on that board are business folk, and one of them was telling us about the fact they have real supply problems getting stuff from Vietnam because they're still so crippled with COVID that they can't manufacture and things like that. So we are still right in the middle of this thing. But we're also dealing with a government that's way of working is like nothing most of us have ever experienced before. And that's not a party political point. It's just a reality thing. Back in the olden days, you know, when I was young and much younger looking, there were certain rules to how you dealt with certainly central government, you know, departments, so that you would know the civil servants, you'd engage with them, you'd meet the ministers, you'd talk to issues, you'd respond to papers, you deliver consultations and things like that. And that just doesn't happen anymore. You also used to be able to work very directly with whichever particular government department was responsible for your bit of the sector, so health or justice or whatever. Whereas now an awful lot of the way in which government is behaving is very centrally driven, which is kind of ironic, really, because one would argue that the conservative ideology has always been about absolutely decentralizing, pushing things out. But actually, this is the most centralized government we have ever worked with. Literally everything is controlled by number 10 and the Treasury, you know, which we've never experienced before. We will have meetings with civil servants in other departments who will say, like, we need to get back to the Treasury on that, or we need to check out with number 10. It's weird. And we never even got that under a Labour government. And we're all kind of struggling to work out how we deal with that. And to be honest, so are the civil servants with whom we deal. They themselves are also kind of like not really sure how things work. And you could say that that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't know. I mean, there are those who'd argue that we need to like shake up the way in which we run government. Others might say the opposite. Either way, it's where we are. And it's actually quite difficult to navigate. So I think we need to be honest about that. From our perspective, though, it's less that, as a sector as a whole, it's less that the government isn't working in normal ways. And it's much, much more that it's the first government, I mean, so over 35 years now, in fact, Jane, I've been working in the sector. And it's the first time in my 35 years that I've genuinely thought this government hasn't got a clue about who we are and what we do in our sector. They certainly don't understand how we operate. They have no sense of how much we contribute to the fiscal and social economy. The problem is, because we in the sector don't strike, because what happens is when our money disappears, we don't disappear, we stay there. You know, we find a way to continue to deliver the work. It's almost like we hide the fact that if we didn't exist, the country would collapse both economically and socially, because the government would have to raise money to pay taxes to provide the services that we provide, that's funded for largely by the public or by the good hearts and goodwill of our communities and our neighbours. And that's a worry. And it's not because we're not telling them. You know, we are telling them, but it just doesn't seem to be landing. We should be the obvious and natural partner for government and local authorities, and I'll touch more on that later, but we're not. And to be honest, I don't think any of us can really explain why. I do think some of it's our fault, and I'll touch later on what we can do differently about that. But if you're feeling like your message isn't getting through, please don't think it's because you're failing. Actually, sometimes that a colleague of mine, Peter Gilheany, talks about, you know, the fact that we're trying to sell fish to people who only want to buy chickens. You know, and actually that's quite a difficult ask. I just think that's a brilliant way of looking at it. You know, it's not, and we can't suddenly change our fish to chickens because we're about fish. We're not about chickens. Actually, now I think that analogy through, it kind of like, it could be going all in the wrong direction. But anyway, you get the general point. But actually, it's almost worse than that. It's not even necessarily that they don't understand us, but that they're actively hostile in some areas. I don't know if any of you saw the Oliver Dowden piece in the Telegraph, which would have been, I want to say, a month ago now, something like that. So Oliver Dowden was the Minister for DCMS, which is where the Charities brief resides. He's moved on now, obviously, and been taken over by Nadine Dorries. But anyway, So part of the job of the Minister for Civil Society is to approve or ratify the appointment of the chair of the Charity Commission. And he wrote this article basically saying that they were having these interviews for the chairs in the Telegraph. And he said he's going to make it really, really clear that they must stamp down on any charities that have a woke agenda. He's going to really direct them to spend their money in a certain way and to fundraise in a certain way. And actually, the worrying thing was about it was that firstly, he clearly had no understanding of either his powers or the power of the chair of the Charity Commission, because they don't have any, they have no legal authority to do anything like that. You know, provided charities are complying with charity law and delivering for the public benefit in accordance with their charitable objects, you can do what you like, honestly, you really can. But so he clearly didn't understand that, but also the kind of hostile nature of it, you know, this kind of wokeness that charities have, you know, it's a worry, it's an absolute worry. And the lack of this also has been compounded by the fact is that, I mean, many of you won't even know that we have a Minister for Charities, and I think that's fine, actually, because we just blooming well get on with our work. But 2 weeks after the reshuffle, Baroness Barron, who was the Minister for Civil Society, which we queried anyway, because she sits in the Lords, not the Commons, and how do you hold them to account when they sit in the Lords? But she's been shuffled off to education and hasn't been replaced. So 2 weeks after the reshuffle, we still don't have a minister whose brief is to look after civil society and to look after our charitable sector. You know, what does that tell you? And listen, it doesn't tell you that we haven't banged on about it. And in fact, what I will say is that we've just recently written to the Prime Minister basically saying, what the hell is going on here? And there's been a series of very frantic phone calls about, you know, why hasn't this been sorted and stuff yet? But it does say something that we had to ring and say, where's our minister? Are we even getting one? I mean, you know, listen, there are some stats I want you to sort of like, I want you to land in your heads, because I personally find these stats quite encouraging in some ways, but I think it's useful for you to have them. So the stats don't change a huge amount. And in fact, civil society, the NCBO Civil Society Almanac has just literally come out. And it's, if those of you don't know anything about it, please go and look it up. You can have a look. And it just gives you the basic stats about what's going on in our sector. And I'm going to touch on some of it. But typically, if you take our sector as a whole, about 47% of our income comes from the general public. I think it's gone up to 48% in the last Almanac. That's pretty good, you know, so almost half of our income comes from the generosity and good-heartedness of our fellow citizens. About half of that 47% comes from the tin. So it's, you know, from fundraising efforts, et cetera, and the rest comes from shops or fees for services or memberships and things like that. Only 29, in fact, it's 28% now, only 28% of all of our money in the sector comes from government anyway, and about 50% of that comes via local authorities. So for most of us, dealing with central government isn't the biggest issue anyway. It's going to be about the local authorities that we deal with. And even the national spend, about 45% of that comes from the NHS as well, and just a few from central government departments. So there'll be some funding, for example, to justice charities from the Ministry of Justice, and some, you know, some funding from other bits of the government. But mostly, we're not largely affected by money that comes from central government, other than that money that's routed through local authorities. Just under 10%, so about 9.5% comes from trusts and foundations, and that's very stable. We suspect that slightly more came in the last year or so because of the pandemic. Lots of them sort of reached in and tried to find more money to give away, but that will settle back down again, I expect. Only about 5% comes from companies. When you're all saying like, come on, let's chase companies, they'll give us money, I always think it's a bit of a waste of time, to be honest. It's a tiny amount of money for an enormous amount of work and a hell of a lot of compromise, in my opinion. But anyway, I'm happy to be argued wrong about that. And 1% of our income into the sector comes from the lottery, national lottery, are really important to us. So basically, over half of us rely on public money. So either publicly donated money or money via the state for over 70% of our income. And let me tell you something, that makes us really sustainable. The fact that we rely on grants and donations from the public and from local authorities and things like that makes us a longer term prospect. You know, it drives me absolutely crazy. This is why I hate the word sustainable. And when Joe was briefing me and said, Deborah, can you talk about sustainability? I'm like, no, I hate that word. It's a stupid word. Like a child, you know, I'm not using that silly, horrible word. And it's because it's usually the word sustainable is used as a euphemism for sell stuff. You know, it's like you're a sustainable organization as a charity if you can sell something. In other words, don't rely on us for money. But actually, if anything, certainly over the hundreds of years of voluntary activity, the organization that sells stuff tend to be much, much more vulnerable than those that rely on grants and donations. And in the pandemic, definitely we've seen that, because those charities that sold stuff suddenly found they weren't able to sell stuff in the way that they were before, and had a massive impact on their money. It's also this kind of nonsense. It's like, what the hell do you sell? I mean, there's a domestic violence charity that I worked with several years ago now, who were given some money by a funder to set up a shop, because this funder said, look, I'm not going to give you money to run the service. I'm going to give you money to set up a shop so you can earn more money. And of course, what happened is this tiny domestic violence charity, what happened was that the blooming chief executive and the directors and the trustees spent all their time worrying about the viability of the bloody shop, rather than thinking about how the hell they were going to provide the domestic violence services. So listen, don't fall for this nonsense. You know, if you've got stuff to sell and you can, yay. That's fabulous. But please don't feel you're failing if you haven't got stuff to sell and you don't know how to monetize, which is another word I hate, your product or service. You know, if you're relying on the goodwill of citizens, that's the most sustainable way forward. Yeah, so blah, 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 blah. I'm losing my thread already. Sorry, what am I trying to talk about? Oh, yeah. Oh, here's another thing I want to talk about as well, reserves. So we've been having some very interesting conversations with funders about reserves. And one of the things that I've been basically saying is, look, you can't, on the one hand, say, we're worried about funding you because you don't have enough reserves, if you're not then prepared to fund reserves. Like, that's just hypocritical. Like, if you want us to have reserves, fine, tell us that and we'll try and have them. But you also have to accept that we're going to use some of the money you give us for those reserves. So get your ducks in a row. And I have to say, they're being enormously, enormously receptive. You know, I think that the funding landscape, trusts and foundations in particular, are, you know, quite a lot of them are suddenly having like this real light bulb moment where they've begun to realize that the inherent unbalance of the relationship between those who have the money and those who ask for the money, and how much that they haven't really generally understood about the impact of their, frankly, often very controlling behavior. Lots and lots and lots of them, I have to say, are now really, really changing that. And I don't know if you know the Association of Charitable Foundations, but under the wonderful Carol Mack, there's a real sea change in engagement and the way in which funders are thinking about stuff. The other thing about reserves is there's so many myths around it. And those of you who are trustees and those of you who work with trustees, you need to tell them to get over themselves about it. There is nothing in charity regulation that says you have to have reserves. You don't. You have to have a reserves policy, but your policy can be, we're not having any reserves. And in fact, the interesting thing about reserves is technically your job as a charity is to spend the money you're given in furtherance of your objects. It's not to tuck it away. Now, there are those who would argue it's like a good business case is to have loads of reserves tucked away, but actually, is that true? Do businesses have lots of reserves tucked away just in case? And then the other thing is we say that reserves are for a rainy day. So if you spent your reserves over the last year or so, yay, because not only has it been raining, it's been a bloody great thunderstorm and you've needed to use your reserves. So there's no shame in that. And if anybody comes back at you and says you don't have any reserves as a funder, point that out. That if reserves are like a brolly for a rainy day, we've been using the brolly because it's been absolutely chucking it down. So yeah, so you need to get off that thing. Your job in terms of sustainability, is not about building up reserves. It's about delivering your services. And also there's no shame in shrinking. You know, it's like, so there's going to be, apparently the Mail might be doing a story on Sunday about how charities have been whinging and whining and being absolutely pathetic and complaining that it's really hard for them. And in fact, we've all done perfectly well, thank you very much. I mean, we all know that's not true. But the point about it is about recognizing that what we do is we shrink. We're incredibly flexible in the sector. You know, there's no shame in going from £1 million charity to a £250,000 charity. You don't have to close down. What you do is you shrink and you conserve and you do what you absolutely have to do until the environment comes back and is more favourable for you. And let me tell you, over 35 years in the sector, it will. We never, ever stay right down there. It always recovers. We always get back on our feet. You know, that's one of the, and that's the thing about that our sector is, our sustainability is the fact we're so bloody resilient. You know, you just can't beat us. You really can't, because one way or another, we are going to come back and we're going to keep serving the people that we care for. So, and your success and longevity as a charity is absolutely nothing at all to do with your size. It's mostly to do with your business model. You know, it's like, how do you generate your revenue? How do you keep yourself going? And focus on those kinds of things. What else did I want to say? I banged on about selling stuff. I've completely lost track of where I was because I got, oh yeah, here you go. So we are, in our sector, we are about transformation, not transaction. But we are incredibly guilty of behaving as if we're transactional organizations. I'm going to give you an example. So there's a canal. There's an area of canal in a local community, and it's awful. It's dirty. It's badly used. There are needles. You know, sort of dodgy folk hang out there. None of the community want to go near the canal. It's got, you know, upended shopping trolleys. It's just a horrible place. And the community have been moaning and moaning and moaning to the local authority for absolutely years to try and get this thing sorted. In the end, they bite the bullet. Now, the local authority has two options. So option one is to issue a tender for a company to come and clean up the canal. So they issue a tender, 3 years. I never know why it's 3 years, but anyway. And abbs.co.uk win the tender. That stands for a bunch of blokes with shovels. So they rock up, they clean the canal, and then they disappear off. And they come back in 6 months again. It's got dirty. They clean it up again. Then 3 years later, the tender's up again, and the local authority reissues the tender. And now it's another bunch of blokes with shovels win the bid, and they come and clean it up, etc. That's a transactional notion of the problem, which is or what they think the problem is, which is a dirty canal side. Option two is to give a grant to the local Clean Up the Canal campaign. And what they will do with that grant is they'll buy a shed, they'll buy some shovels, they'll run a volunteer program, they'll reach out into local schools, into local care homes and things like that. And they will get the community involved in clearing the canal. They will run events there. They'll create opportunities. There'll be wildlife trips and things like that for the children in the school. That is a transformational view of what we do. And that analogy is true of all of our work. We don't just do the job. What we do is we engage and get people supporting our work. That's why I've always said at DSC, there's no such thing as too many charities. That's a ridiculous notion in my mind, because that's like saying there's too many shoe shops, which, can I just say, as a shoeaholic, there's never too many shoe shops. But that's a very limited view of what we do, because the thing about it is every time you set up a charity, having done that myself, you engage a whole load of people in that who wouldn't otherwise care, your neighbours, your friends, your mates, who you nobble to support you. If our message to the public is just send a cheque, what you get is a transactional thing. I'm sending a cheque to solve cancer. What you don't get is the passion, the commitment, the care, and generally the improvement of society that comes with actually involving people in the work that you do. And I think we need to be better at making that case. We need to stop saying to local authority or to central government or to whoever it is, you know, we can get homeless people off the streets, or we can sort out addiction. We need to talk about the wider, massive, longer term impact of our work, and with passion, without being embarrassed. You know, I'm never ashamed to ask for money. Yes, give me money. Of course, if you give me money, I'm going to transform the world. I'm not going to be embarrassed about it. We don't need to be like Uriah Heep, being super grateful for the money that we're given. I mean, okay, you have to fake gratitude sometimes with some of the people who give you money. Oh, this is being recorded, isn't it? I've never done that. If anyone is seeing this, I've never faked gratitude for money. Anyway, you know what I mean? Of course, we're grateful when people give us money, but we have to behave in ways that actually is what we're grateful for is not the money, it's the fact you've understood how important this cause is. And what we're really grateful for is that you're prepared to support us and move us forward. And by the way, as well as money, can you give us hands and hearts and messaging and things like that? You know, it's about being proud of the work we do. Listen, let me tell you something. I mean, looking at your faces, I can see some of you feel really beaten up, or maybe that's just my face probably, but you know, it's been gruesome. But my God, there are people out there who are saying that they would not be alive if it wasn't for the work that you do. There are people out there who are saying they would not have a life if it wasn't for the work that you do. We are incredible. Are we perfect? No, of course we're not, because we're like a microcosm of humanity. But do we do profoundly important work that's more important than most of the other work that goes on in society? Hello? Yes. So we need to start being prouder and louder and shouting about it a bit more. Where I want you to get angry is about the sort of the way in which the private sector is treated compared to the voluntary sector. And it really annoys me. There's a wonderful woman called Nicole Sykes at Pro Bono Economics. And she did a really good piece of work about the contrast between the private sector and the voluntary sector and how we're treated, especially by government. And she talked about speed, hoops, and scale. So if you start with speed and you look at the pandemic, she makes the point that the money that was set aside to go out to business went out of the exchequer into, you know, the routes to business within a matter of weeks. We were allocated £750 million after weeks and weeks and weeks of campaigning, 200 million of which was allocated directly to hospices anyway. So, you know, no consultation at all with any of us about where else that money could go. And the 750 million overall still hadn't been allocated over a year later. By the end of May, the Treasury and the banks had got out 31.3 billion pounds worth of money into the private sector, to about 745,000 emergency loans they made to businesses. And we got, effectively, if you take out the 200 million that's went to hospices, we got 550 million. That was it. And yet we run air ambulances, we save lives, we get people off the streets, we stop children from being abused. You know, how does any of that make any sense? By the same point that these businesses had access to all these loans, over 45% of charities were drawing down on reserves. And by September, 48% had cut back on their work. And this is another frustrating thing. The job retention scheme, which has been hugely useful mostly for businesses, for some charities, largely was useless to charities. Because if you're running a pub and you're selling food and drinks and there's a pandemic and it's all closed down, then you can't get your people to work anyway. But if you're running a charity, the work doesn't go away just because there's a pandemic. There's still people on the streets. There's still people with terminal illnesses. There's still kids being abused. There's still animals who need looking after. There's still environment suffering. That doesn't go away. And we wrote to Rishi Sunak and said, look, can you not have a salary support scheme for the sector? Because our work hasn't gone away. We're not selling drinks and food and things like that, or, you know, on the high street. We're actually working with human people. And what we got back was no, because fraud. You know, and that goes down to them genuinely not understanding about the nature of our work. So we had so this is me trying to make you really angry, because I'm angry about it. I'm still angry a year on. People say, get over it, move on. No, I'm not going to. We've seen that the fact that so many of us have had to actually reduce our services in one way or the other. And the long-term consequences, like, you know, the amount of money that was lost to cancer research because they couldn't do the work that they needed to do. And they're saying that, well, cancer research has still survived, it's still okay, but well, they've completely failed to recognize is that the impact of that is not going to show up for another 2 or 3 years when there isn't a cure, or there isn't a treatment, or a drug hasn't been developed because the money wasn't there at this time. It's the lack of long-term thinking drives me mad, but that is partly our fault because we're not creating that story. Yeah.
Deborah, can I give you a couple more minutes? Is that okay? I'm sorry.
Yeah, of course.
Because I know we could all listen forever.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine. We're just slightly late starting, so I'm nearly there. I promise. I promise.
Thank you.
Anyway, so there are some really important things that I want to leave you with to think about, you know, for the rest of the day and as you move forward. Firstly, many of us have survived and kept going and have still provided fantastic services. The levels of collaboration, despite what some people say, within our sector are unprecedented. I have never seen charities working together as well as they currently are. Yes, of course, there's still the odd one or two who aren't playing ball, but actually most of my experience has been one of everybody getting together and say, how can we help each other? I've already said trusts and foundations have completely upended their old ways of thinking, you know, and so you take that into your thinking, your engagement with them, approach them like a partner, approach them like a friend rather than as a supplicant or, you know, or somebody who lacks power. And also remember, we're used to things being tough. I mean, we're resilient in our sector. It's never easy, is it? Even when we're apparently flush, money, people don't just wake up and suddenly give us money. You know, we've always had to work hard at it, and we know how to do that. We must be braver and bolder. We matter. Stop being apologetic about our existence. Take more risks. It is not our job to be safe. You know, I always say to trustees, if you're not teetering on the edge of terror, you've got to ask yourself, are you actually delivering the work of your charity? Are you actually transforming lives, which is what we're supposed to be doing? We need to stand up for our beneficiaries with less fear. Speak out. If a policy is rubbish, say so. If you lose money, then you lose money. You know, if your principles have prices, then it's not really a proper principle. So if a policy is rubbish, point out that it's rubbish, but then also tell them how it can be made better. Be realistic. If you don't lose a bid, and this is a really important point, actually, so many of us put in bids to funds and we don't get it, and we then say, please, can we get feedback on why we didn't get it? But here's the cold, hard reality of life. If your bid is good enough to get to the grants committee, once it gets to the grant committee, it's a matter of luck. Honestly, it genuinely is. Not that they're not doing their work properly or doing their work diligently, but the reality is that there's pretty much nothing you could really improve. The chances of your bid winning on that day is going to be because the trustees have had conversations about priorities, or somebody read something in a paper. You know, your bid is really good. And I also find it ironic that we go to funder A, we get rejected, and we say, please feed back what I didn't do right. And then we do that for funder B, which is a completely different funder with a different set of expectations. So manage your expectations. If you don't get a bid, it's often because there are 50 applications and they've only got enough money to give to 5. It's not because you're rubbish. Celebrate successes, you know, shout about how brilliant you are. Hang on to hope. You know, it is so an old boss of mine used to say, without hope, the situation is hopeless. It is our job to be purveyors of hope. If we don't have hope, there isn't any. So hang on to hope, because things will get better. Think of our organizations in terms of resilience, not sustainability. Sustainability shrinks us, resilient grows us. So think of it differently. And I'm going to end by saying with a quote that is what keeps me going, because I've had moments of flat despair, both like, how am I going to keep DSC afloat? How do I keep positive in the face of what feels like overwhelming odds? And this quote is one I want you to commit to your hearts, because this is the one that keeps me going. George Bernard Shaw. This is the true joy in life. This is the true joy in life. The being used for a purpose considered by yourself to be a mighty one. The being thoroughly used up before you're thrown on the scrap heap. The being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the whole community, And as long as I live, it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die. I want to arrive at the great gates of heaven with a packet of fags in one hand and a bottle of champagne in the other, saying, let me in, I've done enough. That was Deborah, by the way, not George. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die. For the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It's a sort of splendid torch that I've got hold of for the moment, and I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations. Burn those torches, burn your bridges if you have to, and just remember you are absolutely awesome, and don't let anybody ever tell you any different. Thank you for listening.
Wow. I'm not sure how you followed that. Deborah, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm sure other people will have found the George Bernard Shaw quote as emotional as I did, actually. It was quite something. I must get a copy of that from you. It was really brilliant. And really great to have you set the scene for the sector in a much broader sense, because I think, you know, we do at times get lost in our own world, our own local area. So really helpful to have the sort of UK-wide view of the sector, and, you know, fantastic to have the challenges that you put out there. So thanks for firing us up. That was absolutely brilliant. So over to Ben Cairns, who is the co-founder and director of IVAR, which is the Institute for Voluntary Action Research. Ben has worked for, has been part of IVAR for more than 21 years. He's supervised and participated in over 250 research and evaluation projects, and has more than 30 years experience and work in and around the voluntary sector, as both the volunteer, manager, trustee and researcher. And Ben's currently leading IVAR's work on learning and grant making. Ben, I'm going to hand over to you now. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try and keep to time so we can get to 11, but apologies if I slip over about 5 minutes. Thanks for inviting me. As Deborah said, it is great to see some faces on the screen. It is a disappointment not to be in the flesh, but next year, hopefully. And thank you for whoever's supporting me with the slides, and we can just go to the next slide now. So I'm going to try and cover 3 things today. A brief reminder of what we've been through since the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic. And as Deborah said, we're not post anything yet, but I want to think about where that leaves us. I was warned not to dwell too much on this, but I do feel it is a really important context for a conversation about future funding because of how much has changed. Some reflections then about what can help us to flourish and thrive as we look ahead to a period of sustained uncertainty and volatility. And then more specifically, what funders, and my particular focus will be trusts and foundations, not government, but what funders can do to make a difference and how we can support that happening. That's the thing I was invited to talk about, and I will definitely cover it, and I'll return to this point later. I think it's important to acknowledge that when it comes to funding, and in particular the question of changes and improvements to practice, there's only so much that we, and by we I mean applicants and funded organisations, can do. Although I will address that, but the power to change does lie almost exclusively in the hands of funders, and we need to acknowledge that. Next slide. So before I reflect briefly on the pandemic, I want to frame my remarks by just telling you something about me that feels relevant to a conversation about small organisations and funding, and to reassure you that I'm not a complete imposter in this conversation, and then something about the research I'll be drawing on. In February 1988, so 33 years ago now, after a period of volunteering for something called a Fulham Good Neighbour service, visiting housebound elderly people in West London, I received a grant of £3,000 from Shepherd's Bush Baptist Church. And this was to set up a new day centre for homeless families, Shepherd's Bush Families Project, in the church's basement hall. And it's still going. And the establishment of the new centre was very much a collaborative effort, an attempt to do something that felt right and proper at the time. There were many founders working together for the common good. So this was familiar, classic voluntary action, the kind of work that many of you, I'm sure, are involved in. Residents and enthusiasts and professionals pooling their energy and sharing their assets in pursuit of fairness and justice. I moved on in 1994 to manage an HIV charity that 4 years later was part of the national merger with Terence Higgins Trust. And then in 2000, I co-founded IVAR, where I've been ever since. So last March, we closed the IVAR office, and along with the rest of the world, we tried to work out what to do. And our response to the COVID-19 crisis was organized around three principles: being generous, trying to be useful, and striving to add value. And since then, we've spoken to about 1,000 voluntary organizations across our portfolio of research. And in every conversation, whatever the focus, we've heard about how small charities, social enterprises, and community groups have been coping and adapting. And I have to say, in line with what Debra said, we have been inspired by individuals holding their teams and organizations together in the toughest of times. And we've reflected on how funders in particular could best support their efforts. Next slide. So over that time, we've been in touch with a great diversity of organisations across the breadth of the UK, and who've been affected in different ways. And they have found common cause and support in coming together, sharing ideas and experiences, and finding spaces to express exhaustion and doubt, helping them to gather their strength and keep soldiering on. And I think one of the great gains of the last 18 months is that our organisations have become more human. And our work has revealed, in common with many others, the ingenuity, the dedication, the creativity, the compassion, and the sheer hard slog that has characterised the extraordinary voluntary sector response to the pandemic. And Debra's right, there is so much to be proud of. And this is not a new thing to say about voluntary and community organisations, and we don't need researchers, frankly, to tell us that running a small organisation is not an easy thing to do, to say little of keeping it going. In fact, most of the sister organisations that I was campaigning with in Shepherd's Bush 30 years ago no longer exist, and some have shifted their focus or lost their way or been absorbed. Few, if any, have been able to stay true to their mission and values. So what is it that helps voluntary organisations flourish and thrive? What enables smaller local organisations in our communities to stay afloat and remain relevant and useful, steadfast and principled? What's the nature of the challenge we now face in 2021? And how can those challenges be met and overcome to the benefits of the communities that we serve? I want to just remind ourselves about 5 of the key pressures that organisations have been facing over the last 18 months. And these echo the excellent Community First Yorkshire survey reports that have been published over the course of the last 18 months. First, funding. As Debra's noted, many funders moved heaven and earth to provide emergency funding, and that supported rapid responses, and they took a light touch approach. And this was hugely valued and much appreciated. But, and there is a but running through this, the pipeline for longer term applications has been seriously disrupted. Second, many organisations uncovered new needs, some transformed their services, others went into a holding pattern. providing what support they could from afar. But the sense of never being able to do enough was profound. Thirdly, the shortcomings of communicating on squares have become clear. Perhaps we're witnessing it today, from the loss of informal spaces through trying to support vulnerable service users or even mediate conflict virtually. Fourth, the welfare of staff and volunteers has been a pressing concern. To begin with, staff often threw their all into it, but as the weeks turned into months, leaders wondered how long staff could survive this intensity and keep going. And finally, leaders themselves have had to make tough decisions with no perfect answers, like whether to develop, flex, or close services. There have been multiple balancing acts, for example, between the welfare of users and that of staff. So those are just 5 pressures. It's not an exhaustive list, but I think it's therefore we can say uncontroversially that the period since the COVID-19 outbreak has been a hard, relentless slog, which has taken its toll. Reserves, physical, mental, and financial, have been drained, and I think a perfect storm is now brewing, as more volume and complexity of need meets organisations with diminished human and financial resources. We can go to the next slide, and these quotes from work that we just carried out with organisations in Scotland. I'll just pick out a couple. There's a powder keg of stress and depletion and running on empty that's ready to explode. That's from one leader. But it's also been a story of extraordinary resilience and adaptation, a rare shared period of experimentation and taking risks, and a time when new possibilities and options have sprung up. So before we turn our attention to the question of funders and funding, I want to make 4 quick observations about things that have helped organisations cope with these and other pressures. And when we think about ourselves as funding applicants, we need to be focused on being the best that we can be. That's, if you like, our part of the bargain. Next slide. First, collaboration. The need for joined up thinking was pressing, and the sense of urgency and shared purpose dissolved many common obstacles, as Debra alluded to. Organisations worked together to share data to enable cross-referral, and they felt valued in cross-sector partnerships for their distinctive reach and contribution, and they found and used a stronger voice. The challenge ahead is to embed that joined up working and work hard to ensure that the networks and trust that have been established survive in the face of new challenges. Lack of capacity, resumption of conventional roles, and fierce competition for tight budgets. The risk of defaulting back to pre-COVID is extremely strong and powerful, because that's the dominant learned behaviour that we will carry. Second, taking care of staff and volunteers. Leaders have found ways to support their teams, but the importance of this is not going away anytime soon. Thirdly, discovering new ways to connect. Going online has provided unexpected benefits for many, reaching new people, enabling new conversations, hearing more diverse voices. But we will need to pay careful attention to blended services and ways of working. We've learned about the ways that technology can help us work more flexibly, but also about its limits, particularly in terms of digital exclusion. Finally, responsible and supportive funders. Many funders, as we talked about already, shared risks, relaxed targets and reporting requirements, and were active partners saying, we want you to be responsive to your community needs. We trust you to know best. This behaviour was for many new and different. At IVAR, we saw echoes of the responses to the Grenfell Tower fire, the Manchester Arena bomb, and the attacks on London Bridge and Borough Market. Effective, so-called effective grant making then was described by one voluntary organisation working near Grenfell as easy, quick, trusting and straightforward. Funders stepped out of the normal and that felt good. So how then might this progressive practice be sustained? Next slide. First, let me touch briefly on what we can do as applicants and funded organisations to help make this a transformative moment. First, I think we need to stick and start with mission. Organisations that understand their mission best are those that are strongly rooted with a very clear sense of where and how they fit into the greater scheme of things, including the important question of whether it's necessary for them to exist at all. As we search for answers to questions we face through a period characterized by, to quote Donald Rumsfeld, unknown unknowns, I think it'll be important to strike a balance between remaining true to our mission and core purpose and values, but also being open to the need for improvisation and opportunism, as we have been over the last 18 months. Secondly, we need to know our value, as Debra said. Moving to the front foot and exercising some agency over the circumstances we find ourselves in will be critical to help us perform at our best. And that, I think, starts with reminding ourselves of our roots and our central purpose. That's our spine, why we're here, who we are, as well as what our contribution can be. Much of the rest, the number of people we can serve, the range of outputs we can deliver, the outcomes we can achieve, may now be subject to some guesswork. And we need to be frank about that, as too will funders, which we'll come to in a minute. Thirdly, we need to plan flexibly. Uncertainty is here to stay. We're not post-uncertainty. The new normal is an uncertain normal. And that will require a different approach to planning. So moving away from detailed projects and plans and the fallacy of certainty that we so often offer in funding applications, to a narrative about our core values and our core offer and our core commitment to be flexible. And finally, a focus on well-being. To be the best that we can be, we will need healthy and motivated workforces, equipped and supported for the rocky road ahead. That will require a serious commitment to well-being and an approach that is characterized by, I think, patience, empathy, and kindness. So those are 4 things that we can do as our contribution to resetting funding relationships. What about funders themselves? Next slide. So I spoke at your 2018 conference about flourishing in the face of change. And I went back to what I'd said, and I'm going to quote something. Sorry to be self-referential.